Okay, so we're going to go over a few of the questions from the notes for this video. So the first one that we're going to want to look at is we want to simplify this completely. We're going to simplify this completely. And we want to then, the first thing I like to do whenever we simplify this is move any negative degree that I have. So in order for me to do that, I then need to have 3 y to the 4th, z to the 1st, and then, so this negative 3 needs to go to the denominator, so I have x to the 3rd, over z to the 5th needs to go to the numerator, right? Those need to switch. Notice I did not move the 3. That's because this 3 has a degree of 1. So since it has a degree of 1, we do not want to switch that into the numerator. It's not connected with this x in any way, shape, or form. So our next step would then be to distribute this 4 to every single degree, even on the denominator. So we end up with 3 to the 4th, which is 81, y to the 16th, and then we notice we have like terms here, z to the 1st and times z to the 5th. Well, we know by our exponential rules that we can add those to get z to the 6th. So we have z to the 6th times 4. So we have z to the 24th over x to the 12th. And there we have a fully simplified answer. What's something that I would expect if I were to give you this question 1 on a quiz or a test. That's what I would expect. The next one I want to do is the graphing question that we had on the notes. So let's look at that. We have f of x equals 2x minus 2 plus 3. So we need to notice these transformations. We're going right 2 and up 3. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is find the points in which there will be. So we pull out our calculator. And we go to menu 7 to plug that in, and we get that we have, I always like to plug in a couple different points from our table. So I would say let's plug in -1, and that gets us 3.125. It's always good to plug in 0 because that gets us our y-intercept. So 0, 3.25. And then let's do 2 and 4. So 2, because they're already there. So 2 gets us 4, and 4 gets us 7. So now we have a good amount of points for us to be able, let's move that over now, for us to be able to graph this. So if we want to graph, we make our points, -1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're here, here, somewhere up here. Okay, so that's what our graph is going to look like. Now we want to be able to identify a couple of key aspects to the graph. The first one being the pivot point. So there's 2 ways we can look about trying to find the pivot point. The way I felt like it was the easiest to explain is we want to find an x to make our degree 0. So if we have x minus 2 for our degree, if I plug in 2 for x, I get 0. So anywhere where x is 2 is what I want, and that becomes my pivot point. Another way to look at it as my base pivot point in 2 to the x, my pivot point for that equation is 0, 1. And that's because this is my parent function, so I use that, and that's my pivot point for that. And with a transition to the right 2, I would want to add 2 here, and up 3, which I have right here, I would want to add 3 here, which would then make my pivot point 2, 4 when I add that down. So either way, whichever one makes more sense to you, I like to circle my pivot point on my graph just to kind of let me know I identified that successfully. The next thing I want to do is I want to find my y-intercept, which I already have, at 0, 3.25. We always write it as a coordinate point. I want to have my asymptote, which it's where I approach but don't quite get to. So as I can see that as I go further and further to negative infinity, I get closer and closer to 3. So here's going to be y equal 3. So after I have my horizontal asymptote of y equals 3, I now want to find my end behavior. So for my end behavior, I want to find out what it is as x approaches negative infinity and as x approaches positive infinity. What is my y going to? So for this, my y always approaches my asymptote for if I have a horizontal asymptote here. So as I go further and further to negative infinity, I get closer and closer to 3. So that's whenever I have a sideways angle, an arrow pointing towards the side. Whenever I have an arrow pointing up like that, that tells us that I'm either going to positive or negative infinity. So here I'm facing up, so I know that this is going to positive infinity. So now I have identified all my key aspects to the graph. I've labeled everything I need to label, and that is exactly what I would be looking for if I asked you to graph one of these on a test or a quiz coming up. For the last one, I want to do a word problem. And that's going to be the one where we compound quarterly. So my formula is A equals P 1 plus R over N to the N T. Okay, so I know that this is my initial value, this is my rate, this is how many times I compound my interest. So in the equation, it's given to me as quarterly, and then here's my time. So I've identified everything in the graph that I want to solve for, and I now can plug in the information that's given to me. So it tells me that there was $500 initially deposited, and we want to find out when will there be $600, so that's our final answer that we want. We have 1 plus, it gives me an annual interest of 8%. So when we write it in our equation, we form that into a decimal, so we get 0.08, and it's given to us as quarterly, so over 4, and then to the 4, and we want to find our t. So if you're familiar with this function on the calculator, great. But here we actually want to use the equation solver. So we go over to A, hit execute, and we want to hit F3 for solver. And now we want to plug in exactly this equation, except in order for our calculator to be able to read that, let's let x equal t. So that way our calculator will be able to read it. So we plug in 600 equals 500, 1 plus 0.08 over 4 to the 4x. and we then hit solve. So we see that it pulls up x equals 0. We know that that's not correct. We hit solve because that pulls up the last answer. So we get t equals 2.3. And so we then can be able to tell that that's our final answer. So where t equals 2.3. And that's all for this notes video. I did tell y'all the other day that it was important to do the homework. And so if you watch the video to this point, I'll go ahead and tell you that the question that's going to be on our daily as a warm-up, which will be for a grade, is question number 21 on the homework. So be sure to do question 21 and be ready to do that as soon as you walk into class tomorrow morning or Thursday morning. Thanks. Hope y'all have a good one. Bye.